We don't see anything. Okay, there we go. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me here, Freya, Cosmin. Thanks for having me to Hong Kong. It's really a pleasure to be here. I thought maybe a good thing to talk about here is a kind of story involving an exhibition which was probably one of the most incredible exhibitions I've ever seen, but also that has also one of the most incredible things that I've experienced, in the sense that it's in the way that it compacted and brought together so many different kind of social and cultural, economic factors, and kind of fed me through it and kind of cracked me open myself, and did something, changed me, altered me, and this was, yeah. So I'll kind of tell you the story about it, and certain kind of, maybe hopefully not too paranoid ramblings related to its effects. But the exhibition was a 2012 Taipei Biennial, and I was basically invited to go there in 2012 to edit the catalog for that year, and the title of the exhibition was Modern Monsters: The Death and Life of Fiction. It was curated by Anselm Franke, and so basically I just went there in 2012 with only a few months' notice. I started researching the catalog, and the work was kind of moving along swiftly and well, and everything seemed to be kind of fine. Until I got to Taipei. And then that's kind of like when things, like everything got much better, like even better, but in a kind of like terrifying way, yeah? So like something kind of broke open when I was there. So it's like the child of a mainland Taiwanese mother, which is, you know, me, visits Taipei for an exhibition about the use of fiction in narrating historical trauma, often as a way of absorbing, where often this narration is a way of absorbing the effects of horrors experienced by a family or by a part of the world, without confronting precisely what had taken place, right? So it's about fiction on the one hand, but then it's also about how certain brutal realities of history are fed through fiction as a kind of like both a cleansing mechanism, but also a mechanism for distancing, but then also for bringing closer, right? Which I think is also an interesting way of looking at the kind of exhibition complex in general. And so the question that Anselm was posing was essentially, why or how has the unimaginable scale of atrocities that have been committed basically in the modern period of China or in East Asia as a whole, for that matter, how have they been so covered up or unregistered in the contemporary life of that part of the world today? What happened to the memory of this experience, and how did it move into forms of fiction and writing as forms of external memory, right? So like external memory, even in the sense of like a hard drive or a USB stick or something that can be removed and to float from one machine to another, right? Or from one person to another, from one mind to another, right? So these are just some of the works from the exhibition. There's one of them was Gao Cheng Li, who did a video kind of essay about his father, who I think it was his father who was shot in the head, and lived with the bullet that he was shot with embedded in his skull, and he continued to live happily, and everything was actually kind of fine. He just had this bullet embedded in his head, right? And there was Deng Xiaoming who did this. He did this installation out of an incident that happened in, I think, 1961 in Taiwan, where a young girl was murdered, and Edward Yang did a film about it. And yeah, a monument for the impossibility of figuring it out, right? And it was a kind of, I think this moment was a kind of loss of innocence in Taiwan. during military dictatorship, and he had this sculpture, this kind of first realization of a certain darker side of society, right? A certain public admittance of this, and then he had this combined with a kind of almost like a computational kind of probability mapping of basically why this algorithmically and probabilistically, like why this incident could only happened, why it could never have been actually avoided. Yeah, I'll just move through these quickly. The catalog publication that we eventually did after some time, Boris Ondrejka's dark contribution to it, William Orebeck. So this was basically the curatorial premise that Anselm Franke, the curator of the exhibition, had set up for it, right? But so when he told me about this, I was originally really suspicious. Right? He sat me down in like June of 2012 and he explained it. And when he first told me about it, I was completely enraged, right? So like what gives this German curator the right to discuss the historical traumas of a part of the world that he is not part of, or that he, what does he have to do with this? What is his claim to it? Why does he want to kind of rush into the cemetery with a crowbar and just start opening everything up, right? Like why? What, right? So maybe like what is his relation to this to these traumas in the first place? Right, so then I started to realize that this was actually a completely like naive question for me, because rather than actually answering this question, or actually I never even got around to answering this question in a way, because I started, something kind of strange happened to me. Oops. Something kind of strange happened to me, and oh, there's sounds on this. So this is my mother, and this is my grandmother. And it was basically around this time, after Anselm explained this to me, that I realized that in my own history, I actually don't know anything about what happened to my grandmother before 1949. That it's a complete wash, right? But also that I never asked any questions. I never knew that something was missing. Nothing was taboo. There wasn't like there wasn't some kind of an idea that you should not be talking about what happened, right? Or that anything happened. There was actually, there was nothing to even ask about. And then I started to think, actually, whatever is wrong with this exhibition is actually really, really important and really, really interesting. So I think actually it was this time when I went back to Seattle, at my grandmother's condo, and I started to ask her questions. And I started to say, well, what happened? What happened in the 30s? What happened in the 40s? How did you get from one place to another? And she basically said, I don't know. Like she herself doesn't know. And she would say, like, ask John, right? Her nephew. And John works for Delta Airlines in Atlanta or something like that, and he's the one you want to talk to about the family history. I'm like, but you were there, what? But it's gone, right? But my mother keeps going. Yeah. So basically, I wasn't able to answer these questions. So I started to really wonder what was going on.
She's self-conscious.
Oh, I don't think you have to worry about that.
You take my fun away. You take my fun away. Lose my spontaneity.
That's my grandmother. Okay, so the other part of the story with this that makes things even more, that made me spin even more around this time when I went to Taipei, right? So this was in around, I think it was like like August or September of 2012. And so this was a very kind of strange time in the world, but then also for me, because yeah, I mean, I've lived for a long time in the Middle East, and I was watching very closely what was happening in 2011 and 2012, and had a lot of people who were close to me in this part of the world. And right, so at the time, the situation in this particular part of the world, in the Arab world, was starting to take on kind of completely fictional, bizarre proportions. After a certain moment of hope, there was a sudden sense that actually things were going to go a really bad way, right? In places like Syria, as we have seen, things have gotten worse and worse. And you know, in a place like Egypt, for example, there was a kind of sudden, after a certain kind of burst of hope, people were starting to realize that actually, you know, after this moment where something broke open, that there was actually going to be something a much harder kind of self-investigation, right? Where people realize that actually, if you want to change this system, right, it's not only a matter of kind of like removing this father figure or cutting the head off of the beast or something like that. People started to realize that actually this kind of system was an entire kind of apparatus, an entire structure that had already kind of moved into the body, right? So it wouldn't be a kind of clean operation, changing the society, making it better, right? It wouldn't be a kind of clean operation like, you know, switching out a kind of old set of clothes for a new set of clothes, you know, a much nicer set of clothes. It would be more like, you know, removing a limb or something, right? Something that had become a part of you already. So these were very kind of dark things to suddenly realize, combined with just simply the realities of the things that were happening and have since been happening in this part of the world. And yeah, I mean, they were already starting to take on kind of completely fictional proportions, and yeah, I mean, many kind of journalists, friends, bloggers, and people who were very close to what was happening, they would basically admit that, you know, we have no idea what is happening. So you would have, you know, foreigners, or like, especially like European friends, would have very informed opinions about what was happening and what would happen after the, you know, the great uprisings. But then, you know, the ones who really studied and knew what was happening would basically say, like, it's just a wash. Like, I have no idea. I have no idea. It's complete. There's no way of knowing what will happen. So this was also like another part of the landscape at the time. So since we're thinking about exhibitions as autonomous fictional realms, and the 2012 Taipei Biennial, it's this biennial that tried to think through the way the fiction writing would distill and transfer the experience of historical atrocities, the thing that really scared me was the way that the situation was reversing, but also kind of expanding, right? So Anselm's exhibition that focused on fiction, it often took the approach of this kind of horror show of brutal realism, but then at the same time, the brutally real situation in the Arab world was starting to become, you know, completely dreamlike and hazy. So all of these things were connecting to each other in this very strange way. So anyways, in Taipei, meanwhile, the food was just totally out of this world. It was really, really good. And I started to speak Chinese again with friends, and people like weird. Like, I spoke Chinese. Wow, it's like totally forgot. And like the economy is like spectacular. Everything seems to be going really well. And it really felt like all of the problems of the world were just like really, really far away. Right? This is Kojo Eshin kind of looking fabulous and really happy walking along the river. But you know, I mean, Taiwan is, of course, as you know, it's a kind of funny kind of country because it's barely even that, right? It's unrecognized by most parts of the world. It's caught internally by a political bind having to do with its very sovereignty. But at the same time, its economy has grown so steadily over the past 40 years or so that it often seems that cross-strait economic trade has effectively already superseded and completely gone beyond the question of national sovereignty or national identity even. So like in many parts of the world, trade seems to respond to these questions faster than anything having to do with art or even like something in the political field is able to do. So this is when I started to ask myself, at a time when the horrors in Syria were becoming unimaginable, and this particular part of the world was sinking into darkness, why is this part of the world bursting with life? And why, after having spent so little time here in Taipei, does it seem to want me to merge with it, as if with some kind of a long-lost family? What is this particular force of identification that is at work here, and that seems to produce its own kind of seduction, that works through like some kind of like geoplanetary magnetic kind of magnetism, right? Like, what is this kind of strange attractor? So I started to think that the economic prosperity of this particular part of the world seemed to be producing a force field that was drawing me in. But as it did that, it was also making certain demands. I started to feel that an emergent new organizing logic of the planetary economy was at work. Some kind of new force of global capital that works through codes of cultural identification, almost in the way that algorithms facilitate high-frequency financial trading. In this scheme, basically, you can travel and move on the condition that you accept to only be what you can only ever only be. It is the opposite of certain kind of liberal ideas around self-realization and the agency of the individual, or queer ideas of elected identities and symbolic switching. It is much more interesting, but also much more threatening. It may be the monster of history. It may be the conservative node of liberal kind of networked ideas of freedom and emancipation. So when I told the artist Hu Fang my Taipei story, he told me something that was really interesting. He said he described it as a conflation or an inversion of the classical literary distinction between grand narratives and private individual narratives, right? So like what you think of in something like Russian novels or in Shakespeare, where you have like a private love or passion between two individuals, but this serves as the exception to the grand narrative of like warring states or families, right? So you can think of Romeo and Juliet just as the most obvious example. So in this scheme, the private individual narrative becomes exploded or expanded to become the political or structural grand narrative. So it can be interesting to compare this to what has happened to art history in the past 20 or 30 years, in the period after contemporary art emerged, when art production became at the same time both globalized and financialized. Without a clear formal, cultural, or contextual base along which to plot a historical line of development, we end up truly trapped in the present time of the contemporary, with no front and no back, no beginning and no end. So art history, as we once knew it, essentially came to an end and was replaced by the endless circulation and recombination of forms and meaning effects. So while traditional types often like to criticize this change or this period for being a result of the emptying out that capitalism and money produce, it is also extremely interesting that it actually seems to follow exactly what Hu Fang pointed out, that the grand historical narrative of art history has been replaced by the private and even forgotten or erased histories that were never included in the historical narratives of the past. But then if we want to kind of push the argument a little further and make it kind of more extreme or more perverse, we might also want to follow the traditionalists a little further and propose that actually the sudden disappearance of our ability to write history or agree on a common history in the midst of global kind of whateverness or together whateverness, does produce an active void or vacuum. And this vacuum is actually seeking to mine our individual histories or our historical glue for purposes of collection, for making the database of the network make more sense, or make some sense, for making links and relations between its parts. My main concern is that these links and relations may or may not be the ones that we have chosen ourselves, a bit like an arranged marriage, where the warring families or states of the grand narrative invent a love that wasn't there before to serve political convenience or the needs of database management. With this comes the liberalization of entrenched traditional orders and their historical grievances and memorializing mechanisms, which become increasingly dizzying when transposed onto a present time when the politics of spectacle and visibility already demonstrate a latent claim to heal existential and historical wounds. It is how progressive democracies redeploy information-based economies to create symbolic registration mechanisms to absorb the pain and the guilt of historical losses. This is a symbolic regime that is identified an interchangeability between linguistic or semiotic devices, basically a spotlight or a category filter, and the erasure of people and places. It converts history from a sequence of events to a mnemonic device with infinite capacity for sympathy by way of spectatorship and distribution as registration. It is a far more confusing quagmire than the map territory relations we know of from the internet, because it reformulates the position of the dead in relation to the living. It mobilizes the medium of memory as the connective tissue that holds them together. It pacifies the anger and the regret, the sense of lack, by offering formats of expression, turning a framed photo of a loved one on the mantle into a 16-channel immersive art installation documenting exhaustive autobiographical research into one's own ancestors at various municipal archives. And these formats of expression are most destabilizing when they appear to, and often do, supersede functions of accounting and justice traditionally performed by larger officiating bodies such as states. It is a privatization of mechanisms of justice functioning at the precise point where justice itself can only rely on symbolic and semantic relations to heal wounds that are in essence relational. Now we are only beginning to see how this enormous investment into symbolic modes of registering losses and cataloging injustices has another effect of unfurling or unrolling a Ponzi scheme that modernity has been running the entire time. Because modernity always had to bury what could not connect. To stay alive, it had to run a campaign of using anything from the nation state to food packaging to absorb the rootedness of identity into modular abstraction schemes to market rationality, even to itself. Some like to call this marketing scheme capitalism, but now it appears that when we talk about markets and libidinal forces and that kind of stuff, we are no longer talking about capitalism at all, but about something else that it has given way to or unleashed from inside itself. And this is something else seems to take the form of a feedback loop of some kind. We know how people like Deleuze wrote about desire as a recursive machine following the demands for liberation, 1968 and this stuff. But now we are inside of some kind of planetary internet that has already captivated and deployed a certain kind of liberty towards economic spread. And this seems to have hit its geographic and terrestrial limit. But now it goes on the prowl for another terrain of capture, and it begins to take hold precisely in time. But not time in the abstract, and not labor time or leisure time or production time, but another time that is stickier and longer. in time as a means of accumulating historical identity. It is a feedback loop of identification that does not latch onto desires as such, desires for goods or commodities, lifestyles or images, but it digs much deeper into one's very soul by seizing one's actual identity, mobilizing its meaning effects, by feeding it back onto itself to produce amplified or accelerated or attenuated iterations of one's own basic composition and historical makeup. So this makes it a mistake to look at something like financial speculation as the folding and deployment of that time, when actually, what it really wants is biography. The monster feeds on biography. That's why it's so short, my biography. It draws maps by forming connections across distances, and the legibility and availability of these connections must feed on characteristics that cannot be altered in order to stabilize a network that can only be relational insofar as the nodes are not. Just watch as the sect becomes a new nation, as the people around you dress and behave more and more like you than you thought you did. As you start to constantly run into people from your past more and more often. As your history starts to haunt you more than you ever thought was possible. The interesting thing is that this functions at the level of an identity that is not chosen, but that is historically received. It is not the cultural identity that you want, or even the one that you bought on the market in fashion or in fantasy, but actually the one that you were born with, and you can never change. The one thing you can only be, and always will be the thing that you will just kind of fall into. In cultural studies, there is not much thinking on identitarian issues that does not take for granted a subject that is to some extent free to negotiate identity as something that can kind of slip and shift around in some kind of like soapy postmodern bathwater. But this thing that I'm sensing is truly coming from another place. Maybe its own ancestor was called fascism, but that was a political ideology, and this thing does not come from people. It comes from something else. Maybe it comes from deep inside the liberal project, loaded into the economy and spun into a planetary internet. It is your history, your search history, and your birth history, and the movements of your family and the language they supposedly speak. This is cultural production as historical retrograde construction, autonomous only from people and individual subjects, because it comes down from the top and rushes into the present from a time you thought had passed. And you are not in control of it any more than you are in control of where you were born and to what parents and in what country. No wonder China expects 5% of its GDP to come from cultural industries in the coming decades. They know this is the heartbeat of a phase of exchange and consolidation that we can no longer call capitalism, but that we don't yet have a name for. Basically, you can dress and drag all you want, but we all know that whatever this is will never allow you to be anything but that kid from the village, so you better face up to it. Or not. Another response is to spin off its surface. If you can twist your body at just the right moment when it tries to subsume you, you just might slide across its skin and get a feel of its face. Commit that shape to memory and reproduce it in as many ways as you can until you recognize it as the face of the beast. Feed it back its own tail and don't fall into the loop when you plug that thing into its own mouth. Tell the folks back in the village to go eat it or dress them all in drag. Paint it wrong. Make it not what it is. Don't be what it wants you to only be. Take that money from the free zone. Accept it. Get some security for yourself. But always, always shove that tail right back into the dragon's mouth. Ask who is subsidizing you to talk about your identity. Ask why they need you to only be what you can only ever only be. Accept that you get your own quarantine at an art fair to translate your historical grievances into TED Talks. Ask why you cry out for infrastructure and subsidies whenever a golden microphone lands in your hand. These are no longer contradictions to disentangle, but a meticulously coordinated accumulation of resources around certain historical grievances. Thanks.